All right, I've got the parts all kind of roughly sanded. I have made a routing jig for the hinge. So here's the hinge here, and that fits in there nicely. And I've got the distance set from my fence to the back here. It's slightly less than half this distance. So that's how far I'm going to route in here. So what I'll do, I'm going to clamp this on here, and I've measured in an inch from each edge like it shows on my drawing. I'll put that on there, align it and clamp it in place, and then I'll route out the mortise. I've set the depth of cut so that it is, I don't know if it's going to show here, but you get the idea, so that it's comes through here and into here the thickness of one of these leaves. So that should be set and good to go. I'm not even going to do a test cut, which I may regret, but I think I'll be okay. I'm going to square up the corners now. All right, that looks good. We'll do the rest of those. So I've got the mortises in the shelf. I'm going to install the hinges on the shelf side so I can mark the support or the fixed side of that. So in order to do that, I've of course got this in place. The screws that I'm using, the hinges don't come with screws. So I had some number 3 by 1/2 inch screws that I had from a previous project. They're pretty tiny, they're brass, so you got to be really careful with these. It's easy to break them. So I've got the hinge in place. I'm going to use a Vicks bit or self-centering bit to just go in just enough to dimple the hole and go in, I don't know, maybe 1/16 or so. And then I've got a 1/16 drill bit that I use for the pilot hole. I want to make sure I don't go through, so I'll use my depth stop to make sure that happens or that doesn't happen. And then I'm going to thread in a steel screw first. I think I can find one that's relatively close to this. It'll kind of, create the threads. And then I'll put these in. I'll mark the other side, make the mortises do the same thing, and we should be in good shape. All right, I've got this figured out now. Took a couple tries here. So I'm threading in with a steel screw first, and that's going in till I'm there. I'm feeling a little bit of it coming through there. So that's establishing the threads. And when I put in the brass screw, what I found was a couple things. One, they're a little bit too long, so I had to cut it. And two, there's this unthreaded portion that doesn't really have any place to go. So I had to come back with a little bit bigger bit and drill down a touch deeper. So I used my depth stop again to do that. So there's one of the cut screws. And that worked fine in that first hole. So these are a bit fussy to get in here, but that's going to work. I've got the hinges on here now on the shelf side, so I'm going to take my marking knife and mark so I'll know very accurately where to put the hinges on the fixed side. So I'll go ahead and do the mortises and do the same thing and mount the hinges on that side. It's the next day now, and I routed the mortises for the hinges in the fixed part of the shelf. It turns out this is a new part. The first time I did that, my part, I don't have much to hang on to here, and the part slipped while I was routing it, so I ended up messing this up. So I made another one of these, no big deal, there's not a lot of material there. Made sure I clamped it down this time around, and everything's working good now. So next up, I need to drill the holes for my pivots. And I've got this radius here. I want to pivot around that radius. I really want to make sure I'm pretty accurate at each end of this. I can't really put this on my drill press. It's too tall. I mean, it would fit if I really dropped the table down, but it'd be hard to hold it in a consistent position. So what I did is I made this jig, and I've used things like this before. I like this particular style of jig. So the way this works is I need to drill an 1/8 of an inch from this surface and an 1/8 from this surface. So I've drilled a hole in this piece of hardwood, I think it's cherry, an 1/8 of an inch from the edge and an 1/8 of an inch from the end. I've pin nailed a stop on here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to, on my bench, put that like that and drill from this side, and then if I flip it to the other end, I can do the same thing from the opposite end, and because my references are the same, the hole should be in pretty darn close to the same spot at each end. I typically, if I'm doing that, I want this piece not to be much thicker than about 1 inch, because if I drill through this way, the bit has more of a chance to wander as it's going through, and because I want to come from both sides, I want to be real consistent. So this works well. I did have to check my drill press the first time. The hole wasn't quite aligned. It turned out the table on my drill press was slightly out of square. So anyway, this should work now, and I'm going to go ahead and drill the holes in here. So it's a 3/16 hole in here. The other pieces, I'm going to have a hole in the underside of this fixed part where it's going to pivot like that. So that I can easily put in my drill press, and then I've got the pivot down at the bottom. Remember, I left that long to make it easy to hang on to. I'll drill that at the same time as I'm drilling this one. I'll set up a fence, and that should be pretty straightforward. I've got my jig set up here. I've got the part just held down with this hold down. Got the jig clamped on here. I've got a twist bit. Now I did this in a piece of scrap just to make sure this worked all right. And I initially tried it with a brad point bit, but brad points don't work well in end grain. Twist bits work much better. And because plywood's half end grain, half face grain, the bit just didn't want to cut very well. So I've switched to a twist bit, and this cuts much better. I've also got it set so that when I bump into this stop, I'm into my part about 3/4 or so. So that should work fine. All right, second hole. Now, you might have a tendency just to flip the part, but I wanted the same reference, so I had to spin it this way, which meant I had to turn my jig around. And I had to reset the depth of this because this thing isn't sticking out the same on both sides. All right, my microphone's on now. I want to cut the brass pieces. Now, I don't know if I've showed this yet, but these are my pivot and the socket there. So I've determined that I need to cut this 1 1/8 inches long. I've got a metal cutting blade in here. My small sled. I'm setting this stop block 1 1/8 inches from the edge of this is 1 1/8 inches from the blade. So I'll clamp that in place. And now in order to cut that 1 1/8 inches long, I just need to line it up with the edge of that and make my cut. So it's not trapped. That works out well. It doesn't have to be perfect, so it's going to be certainly close enough. So let's go ahead and cut a couple of those. Now I'll do the same thing with my pivot. I'm going to drill for the socket for the pin now. So I've got the fence set. I've got this accurately marked. I measured over 13 inches like my drawing says. And I've got the depth set, so I'm going in about 3/8 of an inch. While I'm here, I'm going to chamfer the edge of my pivot. So I just, it's the same size as the drill, but I just chucked it in the drill, in the chuck there. Let's see. I've got the support in a vise. I'm going to tap the pin in. I want it to stick out about 5/16. I cut these bushings at about 3/8, so I want the pin slightly shorter. So I'm just going to tap this in, and then a piece of scrap here, it's about 5/16 thick. So that works. And then for the bushing, that hole's, I think, a touch deeper than it needs to be. So I'm going to just tap that till it's flush. Okay, and I've already got the ones in the other parts. And I want to chamfer that a little bit there. Now I could, it looks pretty good. I'm not going to see it when it's all together. I was thinking I might sand that, but it's fine. So that looks good. And so that's going to sit like that. And that will pivot like that. This will sit like that. So I'm going to cut this to length now that I've got the bushing in there. It's going to be about 1 inch long. I'll drill a couple of holes there for the screws, and I'm going to attach this to just a scrap piece for now. The trailer's in storage right now, so I can't install this till we get it out next week. All right, I've got it mocked up, just got it screwed to a piece of plywood. It works well. So when that's folded down, that sits like that. So everything's nice and tight. Yeah, just like I had hoped. Now, a couple things. I was a little concerned about these screws going in the edges of the plywood here. Yeah, one of them did crack a little bit when I put the screw in, so I'm debating whether or not to replace this part with a solid piece of wood. I'll probably just leave it and just be careful when I put the screws in. The other thing I did that I thought would be helpful, notice that kind of snaps into place. So I've got a magnet under here, a rare earth magnet that aligns with this one of these screws. So when that comes down, it won't be bouncing around when we're traveling. The other thing I did is when this comes out, boom, pops into place. I put a couple of magnets, one on the underside here and one at the top of the support here. So that kind of pops into place there. So now this is, not that it needs to be solid, but anyway, it's a little tighter, and you know when this is in a good spot. So I'm going to go ahead and finish this. I've got a door here from the trailer, so I'm going to see if I can find some stain. I can get that to match, and should be good to go. I'm hoping to show one last picture of this installed next week.